Good morning once again, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your break. We're going to dig into compliance with my colleagues, or panelists, colleagues for the moment, Monique, Stefan, and Chris. And how convenient, isn't it, that we just had a boardroom coup at OpenAI to remind us of the ever-present tension between regulation, compliance, and governance.
Exactly. Especially
when the technology in question is so powerful and the potential consequences of missteps are so great. I don't want to spend a ton of time on OpenAI, but I think it helps maybe to begin with one question. And I'm going to start with you, Chris. You're the boardroom expert from EY. So many companies, and banks in particular, are wrestling with that tension between regulation, compliance, and governance. What kind of example has OpenAI set for companies involved in the development and implementation of artificial intelligence? And what kind of lesson, if any, does what they just went through offer?
Interesting first question. Thank you. I think there's a couple of learnings, Erik. I think first, the board is critical. I mean, how a company is governed with tech companies or all of our companies is critical. The board really needs to first understand enough about the technology so they can govern it. And so the skills of the board, who's on the board, is critical. If you look at the profiles of some of the directors that are no longer at that company, they might have been questionable. Also, the structure of the board is key. So this was a not-for-profit model that was governing, billions of dollars of investment from Microsoft and other investors. So the minute shareholders came into the game, it's no longer a not-for-profit model. The other point I'll make, I think there were duty of loyalty breaches, which is a key fiduciary duty of the board. If a board member is actively out in the press with books and interviews promoting a key competitor, that's a huge red flag. So there were a lot of red flags. What we saw is one of the most powerful roles of the board, which is to hire, fire, pay, provide evaluation of the CEO. So that's critical, but to go straight there with the firing of the CEO by an interesting board structure was very, very curious to me.
You might be closer.
Okay.
I think, just so that everybody understands what's going on, we were having some sweater issues. Yes.
Okay. Some sweater issues.
So, Monique and Stefan, to a point that Chris just made,
Yep.
Over the years, banks and, of course, their shareholders have learned the hard way that financial expertise on the board is critical to good governance. Do the risks inherent AI now demand a similar degree of board expertise in your roles? Is that what you would like to see being brought into the boards, for example, of HSBC and Deutsche Bank more and more?
Do you want to go first? I can go first. I think absolutely. I mean, in order for the board to understand the topics and the conversations and the decisions we're making, having board members that can understand the topic, can understand the risk, can understand the benefits, and guide that conversation and provide guidance on where you go is critical. We're fortunate. We have some very technical leaders on our board that have been a part of the journey with it from Microsoft and from other similar companies. But I do think it's absolutely critical, because otherwise the board can't provide that feedback, that governance to you, and be that sounding board to make sure that the guardrails that you're setting, the decisions you're making, are all in line with best practice, are in line with the values of the firm. So I think it is absolutely critical that board members have that kind of skill.
Yeah, so what I would add is I think the financial industry has a unique setup in that sense, because usually on the boards you have already more expertise on the risk side, on the compliance regulatory side than you have in other industries. So that's a pro why the financial industry will play a role in shaping how this technology is used. The con is usually that we are in the financial industry not that strong in terms of technology background. We are much better than 10 years ago, but if you compare us to large tech or even smaller tech companies, usually we don't have the same firepower and expertise on the boards.
So, Chris, where does a board go? Where does a company go to find such expertise? This is such a fast-evolving industry, and to the degree that there are experts, they're mostly gainfully employed, developing and implementing as opposed to governing.
So we've been studying the phenomenon of a digital director. So to both of your points, we're seeing a lot more of those talent profiles coming into the board skill matrix, which is a publicly disclosed representation of who's on your board. Where we find them are all over. Chief technology officers, CIOs, chief data officers, like my colleagues here, are all great candidates. So people that understand, different elements of the digital landscape, both on the business model, the operating model, the risk model. And again, we're seeing a lot more of those skills come in. We're also seeing the advent of technology committees.
Yeah.
In the financial services sector, 21%, I believe, of the financial services companies have tech committees, and that's, if you looked 5 or 6 years ago, that would have been almost zero. So that's new. In banking, half of the S&P 500 banks have tech committees. So again, we're seeing technology being such a critical element of the board that's also a place we're seeing tech talent.
Ladies and gentlemen, now that you've had an opportunity to hear a few thoughts from our panelists, I want you to think of some questions of your own. We would definitely like to have some audience participation in this panel and subsequent panels here today at the symposium, just so that I can gauge the amount of time that we have to use. Is there anybody in the audience who has questions now? I'm not going to go to you now, but I would like to know whether you've got questions so that when we start to weave these things in, I saw Mike's hand go up there. There's one in the front row, one in the back. Okay, this is good. And one other thing I'd like to say is that if someone, so I will reserve some time toward the end of this panel discussion for some questions, but if someone here says something that you find particularly provocative in a positive way, perhaps a negative way, and you have a burning question that you want to ask right now, put your hand up and I will go to you. So this is probably a little more, Monique and Stefan, for you, but Chris, feel free. Operating in compliance with the crazy quilt of banking and securities regulation in the United States and across the world is already challenging enough for your firms and for others, but at least, as I understand it, having spent a fair bit of time on the fringe of finance in my career as a journalist, there's at least some cross-jurisdictional consensus. What's it like now? Trying to innovate and experiment in AI when there is no consensus. There are, as Teresa told us earlier, no rules, not just on who regulates AI, but even how to go about regulating it. How do you deal with that?
So I think it's a very important topic which there is no currently solution, and we are more on the receiving end, right? And we are not managing our regulators and supervisors, but we can help in engaging with them. I think what you see is, especially on the global landscape, that different regulators are moving at a different pace. There is a general consensus on some principles about AI, what you can do and what you can't do, but now we are entering, or about from a technology perspective, the next level, so to say. And you see that it's indeed, as you said, not clear who is doing what across jurisdictions, but also within jurisdictions, right? So in the US, for example, it's easy to turn to the Fed. In Europe, you have to deal with the ECB and with your home regulator, for us, the BaFin, who is looking more on the conduct and money laundering prevention side, whereas the prudential regulator, ECB, is looking on the prudential side. So everybody has different views and different pace of moving forward. Again, we are on the receiving end. I think the best we can do is engage with them and try to explain what's going on the technology side, what we think are use cases that we are comfortable working on and exploring, and helping them to get there. But it's a very painful process. And actually, in the interesting parts, on the control side, for example, of things, I'm not sure that anytime soon we will really see a breakthrough compared to what you will see or be able to do on the technology side.
Similar experience?
I
Is it
think-
as painful for you?
I think I have a different perspective. I think as I look at what we need to govern AI, and more on the generative side, I think there are quite a few rules and regulations on traditional AI. But as you look at the risks and the concerns that we have, there is existing regulation for each of those risks. I think when you're looking at generative AI, it's how do you make sure that you're taking into the extra additional risk that's being added because it's such a new technology, because it can do such powerful things, and we have so little experience with it. So I think the good news is I think we have a lot of good regulation. We have a lot of good controls and procedures within the banks themselves to go above the minimum control governance and regulatory requirements we have. And I think some of the regulators are really focusing on it. You know, we had the UK AI Summit 2 weeks ago. We had the FCA or the OCC has come, or the Fed have come up with recommendations, outcomes-based goals for us to follow as a bank. MAS has done something with 31 financial institutions in Singapore. So I think there's a lot of activity. There's a lot of public-private regulatory collaboration. We will get to the right answer. To me, the big thing that's going to be the challenge is, as all of these regulations are coming out, and because this is so hyped right now, is the best thing, because it's a new technology, would be for all the regulation to be streamlined and consistent, because then we as the banks that serve multiple regulators can better respond to those questions. If each of the banks and each of the jurisdictions come up with unique, different, slightly different or contradictory regulatory requirements, then it's going to be very hard for us as a bank to meet all those individually. So what we're really trying to do is work the MAS Symposium, and I can't remember the name of it, of course, but the MAS Symposium is with 31 financial institutions working together with MAS in a really, really collaborative proof of concept to understand those things will really help. And so I think that's what we're hoping for, that with this new technology, that the regulators sort of do their regulatory colleges, come up with similar regulations where there are specific things, privacy, localization, things like that, they can add on top, but will be really helpful if they were consistently given to us to follow.
I was just going to mention, for those who aren't familiar, it's the Monetary Authority of Singapore. Just
yeah.
help, right?
Thanks.
So, but I think HSBC and Deutsche Bank are a very interesting, so to say, showcase in that sense, because as many of you know, HSBC went on transaction monitoring to the next level by using not generative but regular AI. You obviously got the support of your home regulator. We tested the waters with ours, and they said, the answer is no. So there you can see it is. There are very different approaches to that. Now we work through them, and maybe one day and we get there, but probably like 2 years behind the curve, at least, right? So I think it's a very interesting case, because 2 European institutions in different settings, and there you see how differently.
With different regulators.
With different regulators, right?
Maybe you can share a little bit with us. I have two follow-on questions from what you just said, and I see hands going up, which is great. I'll get to you in a moment. Can you characterize your interactions with regulators so far on some of these more challenging aspects of artificial intelligence?
I think it's very positive. I think we all want to do what's right for our customers. We all want to protect the data. We all, that's a huge thing. Working together, we're learning together. So far, the regulations have been outcomes-based, which is great. They're not prescribing a tech. They're not prescribing the specific way that we do it, but rather this is the outcomes you must achieve. Welcome outcomes regulation. I think it's good for the industry, and it's good for consumers to feel comfortable. So I think it's so far we've been working with, we're fortunate to be in a lot of jurisdictions around the globe. And so we're working with a lot of them, but I think the biggest worry, I think, is sitting in my seat is just making sure that I can comply to them all. So the more consistent, again, back to that comment, the more consistent, the more important, I think the better we'll be able to comply.
Is there really, though, any reason, based on past experience, to hope for that single regulatory standard?
answer that one.
Regulatory synthesis, we might call it. And also, does the speed at which AI is evolving make that impossible?
Or does it make it necessary?
Yeah, what I would say is, first of all, I would agree the interaction and dialogue is constructive. I don't feel that there are major regulators who say, I don't want to engage on this and leave me alone. That's not the case. I think what the real obstacle is, and that is more a technical question, is the topic of auditability. So to what extent are these models, and the more complex they get and the more they are in the generative corner, the more vital that question is. To what extent is the model explainable, the outcome explainable, is it repeatable, and in that sense can be audited? If that question can be answered, and I hear from so to say very smart engineers that they are working on that, if that can be solved, I think that would be a major breakthrough, not only from a technology perspective, but also then for us to engage with the regulators and say, look, we can explain it, it's repeatable, you can, or whoever can audit it, right? And that would make a big difference. Is there a scenario where everybody is aligned and we have a unified regulation? I think the answer is no, because we also don't have that in other spaces that are much more mature. But I don't think that is necessarily what we need. I think we need a in principle common understanding of what are these tools doing and how are we deploying them on a regulatory basis.
And I think it's not just the regulators. We want to do that as custodians of our customers as well. So we want to make sure that we're providing, we're confidently providing good results for our customers. And so I think we're putting those barriers in place. I think, as was heard this morning, we have no models live yet. We do have a lot of generative AI models alive yet. We have a lot of experimentation. We have a lot of focus. But we are monitoring it very, very carefully before we allow something in it. And it may take 2 months, 6 months longer, because we want to make sure that isn't because the regulators are telling it to. That's because we in our own governance feel that's important. So I think it's not just the regulators. I think as you know, as we govern, if we take the accountabilities that we have, we want to make sure that it's good. It's a safe and sound model as well.
Chris, anything to add before I go to our first exciting question from the audience?
Well, at some point, I'd love to talk about the ethical AI policy. You want me to hit that now?
Why not?
So I lead our EY Center for Board Matters, and we've been having broad discussions with boards on just this topic. You know, don't wait. Start to self-regulate and start to think about policies. And I think what's different now, between now and other technologies, is the impact to ethics and values in doing what's right. I think there's a nuance that's more risky here, Erik. So we have 9 ethical AI principles. Accountability, so we've talked about where does that land in the board role, also in the company who's accountable for ethical AI. Data protection, of course, privacy, who owns the data, copyright, IP. Reliability, when is it good enough to go out? 90%, reliability is not good, and that's where we're seeing a lot of use cases now. Security, there's heightened challenges with cyber. I was just at an FBI briefing in Washington 2 weeks ago, and this topic, ChatGPT, brings the FBI to its knees. I mean, there's a lot of other challenges now that they haven't dealt with, so they're working through that. Transparency, right? Watermarking, when we say we have ChatGPT inside. Explainability, and I think Fatina mentioned this with RBC, right? When is the human at the center? Is there always a human between the data set and what goes to our employees or what goes to our customers? Fairness, and this is where the algo bias, those kinds of things hit in. Compliance with regulators, which we've been talking about. And then we have a 9th one, I think, that's interesting around sustainability. So what's the impact to all this data usage on our sustainability platform, which also raises questions about frameworks we haven't seen well regulated with consistent models, right? So there's
example of it's hard to regulate these growing topics, but the link to sustainability is the ninth one we're looking at with our clients.
How about a question from the audience? I did see a hand go. Oh, there are lots of hands now. Who was it whose hand went up before? This fellow right here. Maybe we'll bring you a microphone, and if you would do our panelists a favor by identifying yourself.
Sure. My name is Kevin Bueller from McKinsey. My question to you is, given the compliance and regulatory and other concerns, what do you think will be the use cases in Gen AI in particular that make it across all the hurdles first? So what will be the first few? And what will not be among those first few? What will take a lot longer?
So I can start. I think the first use cases will be in the middle or back office, so not client-facing and not in the heavily regulated, money laundering, sanctions, embargoes, and the like. So, for example, we are currently looking into one use case where we try to come up with a chatbot that would help our employees to understand our policies and procedures that are applicable for them, right? So they put in, I'm a salesperson in this and that division and that market. I want to take a client here and there, right? So what is it that I need to look at? Stuff like that. And I think that will be the first use cases that really then also on the Gen AI basis will make it over the hurdle.
Yeah, I think as I look at it, probably the first, and I think each case has its own risk quotient, and I think we need to be really careful to not paint everything with the same brush. But if I look at the first one, I think code generation, and I think being a traditional techie, we build code and then we test it and then we implement it. The only part the Gen AI part is taking is the building of the code. We're still going to test it. It's still going to go through the operational procedures. It's not going to make decisions live based that it's a Gen AI generated code. So to me, that's a pretty safe space to go. And then I think on client decisioning and those kinds of things is probably the space where you'll go last. We have put, when we move some of these things into production, we will not allow it without a man in the middle or an expert in the middle until we're more comfortable. So that will be something I think for all use cases that will be there, at least until we have the confidence that we don't need that any longer. And that's for any of the use cases. So I think we will follow that rule and that pattern until we're more comfortable with the moving forward. But again, I think the most important thing about this is that really each use case has its own risk, each use case, and you should consider them each independently, because if we flip them all in one group, we'll never move forward. So I think that's from our perspective, we have a pretty strong set of governance principles that each risk owner requires to pass through. And so I think following those set of rules will help us very much.
I want to embrace the very last part of that question and ask you if you've run into anything yet, particularly as concerns generative AI, that just seems like it's a no-fly zone, and an institution like yours will never be able to get comfortable with it.
Never.
Never
is a long time. I think probably right now on the automated decisioning around those kinds of things. For now, I think it's probably not a never.
So that's at the frontier. This is the Q-star stuff. This is the tree of thought. This is the problem-solving side of it.
Yeah, we probably won't do those. Those will not be the first things that go into production.
Oh, no.
But again, I think it's never is a really long time, and to the point of who would have thought a year ago we'd be where we are today. So never is a very hard answer.
I would agree. I think it's very hard to imagine that there are real areas in our industry where generative AI is forever excluded. I think it depends on a lot of problems or questions how we get our arms around and control the risks that come with it. But as the technology evolves, I'm in general positive. So I would think over time there will be technical answers to these questions as well.
More hands. Mike, you have a mic, in fact.
Mike Mayo, Wells Fargo Securities. In the next 3 years, there's a chance or likelihood that the most read article on Bloomberg will be about a bank messing up with AI. What do you think is the most likely scenario for that to occur? Not at your banks, of course.
Of course not.
But in the industry, what are you afraid about?
So from my perspective, looking at today is if and to the extent we would deploy AI models on the risk side of things, so thinking about liquidity risk or capital, and if a model gets it wrong and we don't capture it and then it explodes and just the so to say impact is so high that we cannot bring it back. That's currently what I would be most so to say concerned about.
I mean, we just saw a bank go down, right, in the Valley. And it wasn't necessarily a liquidity issue. It was a run on the bank issue caused by social media. So will there be scenarios like that where the chat capability and function just explodes, rumor mill and things like that to take a bank down? But I think not necessarily ChatGPT, but a lot of just automated notifications to people's phones on pull your money out. So those are the kinds of scenarios, Mike, that keep me up at night.
Mike, it's an interesting question. So, and I'm taking it from a little different angle. So I've been in this role for 6 months as well. We should have a party. Seems like female 6-month CDAOs. But I was the CISO prior to that. And I think my worry would be that we are being too cautious in governing how we use AI in the banks. And we don't put the defenses in against the bad guys who don't have those same controls. And they hit us. I mean, my biggest fear as a CISO is always that my CEO's face is on the front of the Wall Street Journal or Bloomberg, and the fact that we had a cyber attack. And so I think that these tools are incredibly powerful, and so we have to be defensively protecting ourselves as well. And I think that's probably my bigger worry than the offensive. It's the defensive.
Yes, there's someone with a microphone back there. Please go ahead.
So Clement King. So two-part question. One is, a lot of banks have cost constraints, people working on multiple priorities. So how do you foster learning within your teams, especially to experiment more? And the second part of that question is, how do you create a consistent understanding within your team and organizations so when people are speaking to regulators or investors, you have the same consistent message to avoid misinformation?
I can take, I mean, I think the most important thing on this topic is that we have very, very clear communication and very, very clear training opportunities and collaboration opportunities across. We have actually have an AI committee that we formed that actually self-formed across the data scientists, quants, techies, just business people. And it started around the time of the introduction of ChatGPT. I can't say it's completely aligned with that. And it's a self-formed group. And usually those groups, you know, there's 15 people, 20 people. We have about 1,000 people that actively participate in self-defined sessions and conversations around what we do. We have things called AI cards where people submit ideas on where they want to work on Gen AI. So we have a good inventory. We steer people where to go and where not. And we have quite strong governance around who can, because we don't want everyone playing across the board. So we want to make sure we're also POCing safely. And so I think and we have, you know, walled off gardens where those who are allowed to play are playing. They aren't playing just in the open internet. And so I think when you look at it, we are communicating a lot. We are sharing guardrails. We're sharing what we're learning as we learn. We recognize we don't know everything. So we're not trying to be all-knowing from the top. We have bottoms-up and top-down conversations. So I think it's really just about leaving the conversation open, making sure the associates across the firm are aware of what's good and what's allowed and what's not, and then really providing that training and insight so they can stay on top of the freshest trends and what we're working on.
Yeah, we have something similar, but for us it comes top-down from the board. It's in essence led by technology, but with heavy involvement of business and the second line. And in that sense, everything is, so to say, encapsulated in a structured governance, so nobody can play around and so to say do something on the side. I'm pretty confident that we understand what we do as a bank and what we don't do and how we drive certain areas more forcefully forward than others. But as long as you do this, I think you can contain it. In terms of ensuring that you have a constant understanding and messaging across the organization. I think it's not different than other areas as well. So in that sense, I think AI is not specific. You have also other important topics where you need to make sure everybody sings from the same song sheet.
Chris, any thoughts on best practices for as far as consistency and messaging and being on the same page are concerned?
Well, I think the board is engaging more and more with investors directly, and typically a spokesperson from the board is assigned. And again, from an investor communication, I think investors want to know what kind of investments are being made in these technologies. Teresa, to your point, what the return on the investment is on the on the outcomes of the investment. Capital is a lot harder; it's tighter now. So, capital allocation decisions around these technology platforms is key. And with that, tech debt issues, we've been talking about data cleanliness is key and critical. And boards are starting to wake up to understand the criticality of data. But what's the company doing to invest in upgrading systems, cleaning data, and making sure data is accurate in this new world? There's a great professor from Harvard Business School, Professor Kalani, who says that, of course, data is the new oil. We've heard that, but it's also the new silicon, because we don't need chips, and it's also the asbestos, right? So data cleanup becomes critical. So again, boards are trying to help discuss with the investor community, which is often their role, around what are the good things the company's doing to make sure that's a viable company moving into the future.
You've given me a great segue into another question, and we'll go back to the audience questions in just a moment. It was either yesterday or the day before that Rohit Chopra, the CFPB director, expressed his concern over the concentration of power in AI capabilities, specifically around the issue of data. He defined data pools as assets and said they pose a quote-unquote huge question for regulators. And I'm curious whether, in particular, Stefan and Monique, you two, but also you, Chris, believe that banks are, and your banks in particular, are ready for the level of scrutiny that his comment implies, or whether there is still yet work to be done on how to manage the regulatory risk around the acquisition, aggregation, and application of data in the context of AI.
Please.
No, you.
No, ladies first.
Oh, no, I think I couldn't agree more that data is the new oil. Is that what they do? And it is the power of our data is so critical, and I think it's right. We need to make sure that every AI and generative AI model works on a clean data set, because if you don't, you're just going to get bad results faster, right? It's a very clear correlation to that. So, all banks have a lot of work making sure we are already highly regulated around the data space. So I think, we all work very hard to make sure our data is clean, and I think we will, as part of the governance of when models go live, we'll make sure that those data sets are quote-unquote clean and trusted data sources. So I think that's absolutely, it's an absolutely true statement. It is the oil of the industry. I think it's going to be a very interesting thing. My colleague who's going to speak next from HSBC will also say that he believes that data will usurp tech in kind of the importance on how we speed and provide information and serve our customers. So I think it's critical upon all of us to make sure that the asset that is so critical is in good shape.
So I would agree with that, but I would add that I don't think that the financial industry, and especially banks, are at the forefront of this discussion about accumulation of data and information. I think it's the big tech companies. Actually, I would say in the financial industry, it's the other way around. So we break up not capital market information, but client data. We break up between banks and institutions and separate them, which is good, and we should do this and continue doing this. But it constrains us in many areas. So you just think of money laundering prevention, right? one reason why the systems of money laundering prevention are actually not very effective globally is because we keep them contained with each financial industry player and do not share it for very good reasons. And I'm not advocating we share it, but we just need to be aware we are not accumulating that data. That's why we have a hard time to identify how the bad guys, so to say, fish through the system, right? Because our systems are not talking to us. Our both systems are not talking to JP Morgan system for good reason. So in that sense, I don't think we are in that space.
So a healthy competitive environment, in a way, promotes data safety and security to a degree.
I think so, yes. But it comes with a price that we pay for it.
Audience questions. Who else has a microphone?
Hi, Zia Maradi, Chief Data Officer at UBS. I have a question for the panel on, can you describe the monitoring that you have in place for the generative AI models that are in the pipeline? How are you identifying any potential hallucinations and mitigating those risks?
I think if they're going through the same AI model reviews that we have today. So there's no generative AI model that doesn't follow the same capabilities. We are adding to our model governance for generative AI those additional things to test and to validate that those aren't happening.
Yeah, I agree, but also we are, at least with Deutsche Bank, at an early stage, right? So we don't have any of these models in production, and in that sense, we are still also learning how to model, validate them, and where are the problems and how to address them. So it's still a learning curve.
To your knowledge, this is a question that came to my mind earlier when we were talking. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Teresa, you said that JP Morgan had no generative AI models either up and running in a commercial way. They're just still in testing phase. Is that correct? And I think we heard the same thing from RBC. Do you know whether there is a bank that has deployed generative AI in the?
I'm not aware of.
I'm not aware either.
How long do you think it'll take?
I think we will see some simplistic models probably coming in the next 3 to 6 months, probably.
Soon.
Yeah, soon.
I'd say 12 to 18,
There you
but
Different
I would say soon. I would say soon. Yeah.
But I think in the back office, we'll see it faster.
Yeah.
Right.
Outside of
For
customers.
internal purposes.
Exactly.
We have another microphone there.
Hi, I'm Kevin Ellison. I'm president of Minerva Technology Policy Advisors. We're a firm focused on geopolitics and policy of AI. We've talked about speaking to regulators, we've talked about dialogue with investors, but I'm interested in your views on talking to customers about how you're using AI. Where do you feel are the most important conversations to start having now about how you're using AI responsibly and safely? And where do you feel that customers will face their own learning curve in terms of AI, whether it's for cybersecurity or just understanding the issues? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can give it a start. So, very valid question. Our experience is, interestingly and maybe obviously, depending on who you speak to, they have very different views. So, if you talk to a retail customer or in Europe, a mid-sized corporate, they are more concerned about the security side of things, right? How do you ensure you protect my data? How do you ensure, I don't get defrauded, et cetera, et cetera. If you talk to a hedge fund client who wants to deploy models on their side and our side, it's a very different and more tech-driven and more, so to say, into the future looking type of conversation, which makes it very difficult because you need to, so to say, in that sense, square the circle.
Yeah, I don't have a very good answer for that. I haven't actually thought about it. It's a really good question. I think it is a very symbiotic thing. I think we are starting to see that some of our third-party suppliers are actually starting to introduce AI within their platforms. And so as the customer, really want to have that conversation before it comes to us. We've put some new rules in our procurement processes to check for that. But it is a little bit incumbent upon the provider to make sure the customer is aware. And I think we will want to do the same thing before we start doing these things, probably not at the retail customer, but at the more institutional side, we'll want to make sure that we have an open dialogue. They will probably demand it, even if we, even if we proactively do it. But we are, from our side, when our third parties are offering now their products, it sometimes just comes, at Gen AI inside. I think someone said that. I like that. It does just come, and that is something that we are working very hard to make sure that we manage, because we don't want those freebies. We want to make sure we're aware of what's coming.
And I think in the explainability world, and we heard this on the last panel as well, explaining trades, explaining guidance, I think is something, especially younger customers, the millennials, Gen Zs, they're going to want that and value that, right? They don't have such concerns
No,
about
they
their
don't.
own data privacy issues. They're going to want to err, I think, on, am I getting the best advice? And can you explain to me why you're suggesting these trades or whatnot? I think we'll see more of that as an expectation from the younger generation.
Microphone.
Hi, I'm David Hakey. My team builds the credit and fraud models at JP Morgan Chase. I'm also Canadian. I just want to point that out.
Canadian, is that what he said?
A question I have is particularly for, I think for Stefan and Monique. You run global enterprises, and the regulatory environment seems pretty uneven across the UK, the Eurozone, the US, I guess in Asia. How do you view that patchwork of regulation around the world, how it's evolving, how some are more permissive and some are more open-minded, and how do you think about that from a global competitive perspective?
So, look, my view would be, I think it's not a unique question to AI. You see that also in various other areas, that regulators in different regions and jurisdictions have different pace and different priorities. So in that sense, it's unique if you manage the regulatory landscape of a financial institution. Again, for me, it comes down to we need to understand who is, so to say, interested in what and what pace is driving. So I'm aware of some Asian supervisors and regulators that are more, so to say, forceful compared to others maybe in Europe. But in essence, for us, it's trying to take the best of all worlds, listening to them, understanding, and then trying to also facilitate the dialogue and in that sense, the development between the different regulators.
Yeah, I think right now, as I look at how HSBC is attacking the problem, we're really managing it quite globally. So we are looking at all the capabilities all the requests that are coming in across the board, regardless of jurisdiction. And then we're applying a jurisdictional lens after, if that makes sense. So I think for now, and it is very controlled. I mean, what we're doing around AI and Gen AI is quite a controlled space. So we're looking at it globally as we go about deciding which ones to prioritize if and when we do go live. We'll make those conversations from a jurisdictional level, but we're not doing jurisdictionally specific use cases right now.
I'm going to finish with this question, and it cuts back to why we're here in the first place to a degree, what we've learned from the Evident AI Index. There is certainly a degree of dispersion among banks when it comes to how much they're investing in AI, obviously how much transparency there is, how seriously they take certain aspects or the need to develop an AI. But I wonder whether that clearly creates some competitive pressure. And I wonder, to what degree do you worry as employees of your own institutions focused on compliance and regulation and governance, in your case, Chris, about the risk that some banks, or this could happen in other industries as well, of course, will succumb to that pressure to compete and catch up and make the kind of mistake that would, as Mike said, land you uncomfortably in the position of having the most read story on the Bloomberg for the wrong reasons?
Well, look, I think obviously that is a topic that is driving us, and from 2 or 3 different angles. So on the one hand, we are also observing and watching what our competitors are doing. If HSBC is deploying AI and transaction monitoring, I want to know why we are not doing it and how long does it take us to get to that point and what's different about us, about them. Or if JP Morgan is investing much larger sums than we are, obviously we are thinking, okay, is that leading us in a space where we fall behind, and there's a point that then where it gets hard to catch up. So, but I think that's normal course of business. That's not an AI specific topic. I think the specific is that this technology is moving so fast. Now, I think on the more positive side for us is then we are in the regulated industry, which also, as we have learned today, so to say, ensures that you need to make sure that all your regulators and supervisors come along. So that leads you to the question of first mover and second mover problem. I feel that especially on the control side of things, a lot of banks are not very hungry of being the first mover and making the mistake to blow up. But there's a bit more, okay, let's see, one step after the other. Maybe one is running really forward, and let's see how well it works. So in that sense, the regulatory landscape, so to say, adds a unique angle to that competition.
So at one point in my career, I was a CISO and a CTO of the same bank. And I used to say when I spoke, I have an angel and a devil on my shoulder. And depending on which role I'm playing, one's the angel and one's the devil, because both are there. And I think we're facing the same thing. We're facing we need to do these things to help, to grow the economy, to make a better customer experience, to do all the good things that it can do. And we also have the constraint of we want to do it safely and soundly. And so we have to balance that, and it's a balancing act. And we have to make sure that the angel is winning over the devil on our shoulders, but that we're balancing it. So I think it's something that we're going to have to do cautiously and do soundly. And in the data role, I kind of have the same thing. I have to make sure the data's clean and that we're not messing anything up. But I also have to make sure that we're getting value from the data that we have. And so I think it is a balancing act, and we're just going to have to do good governance and best practice and continue to learn and be safe along the way. But you can't, it's one of those things where you have to do a little bit of both.
And I would just add, as AI leaders and executives in the room, help the board govern you better, right? The typical age of the board is 67, not heavy tech skills, as we've talked about. So demystifying these technologies for the directors is one of the #1 things we always suggest, right? Bring ChatGPT into the boardroom and show them how you use it, so they understand the devil and the angel opportunity and risks versus they come in with a report, pound it on your door in the board meeting and say, why are we number 50? And we need to get moving. But I think the board needs help to understand these technologies so they can govern them better.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for such great questions. Please keep them coming, and join me in thanking our panelists.